Hello, shalom and marhaban. You're listening to Yalla Y'all, the podcast which works to combat lies, confront misconceptions, and hopefully, if I've done my job, challenge you to think deeper about things. I'm Amy, your friendly neighborhood biblical resource writer, and I'm so happy you've chosen to spend some time with me today. Unlike the days of rotary phones, cassette tapes, and dial-up internet, we live in a world oversaturated with voices, from email and the immediate ping of the text message to the various social media platforms. Many voices inundate us with claims of expertise, oftentimes underhandedly heralding themselves as bearers of wisdom and truth. These self-prescribed internet experts piggyback ideas and then assert themselves as the leading voice on a multitude of topics, ranging from conspiracy theories and life hacks to meditation techniques and the latest in political trends. And yet, in an age of information overload, why do we fall so incredibly short when it comes to critical thought? No, I don't mean the act of tearing ideas or people apart simply because we are offended. And I'm certainly not discouraging liking and subscribing, heaven forbid. But what I'm speaking of is the ability to think deeply about things, not adhering to an idea simply because teachers or the media tell us we absolutely must, or because Tommy down the street has 57,000 Instagram followers, so must be correct on a stance on immigration, right? Sorry, Timmy. Instagram followers a scholar does not make. But good for you for putting yourself out there. What we need to be are seekers of truth, not relying simply on the opinions of a popular person, sorry Timmy, or of the masses. Perhaps the question we need to be asking ourselves, though it's not a fun one, is this: how many influencers are really worthy or qualified to influence? My fellow listeners, allies, adversaries, and the curious souls in between, we welcome you on this thought journey as we tackle a number of questions and issues, some modern, some formed in antiquity, and some just because I said so and I have the microphone. So if we get offended, good. At least we're thinking. And if that anger leads you to research further down the road, then I consider that a win. So put on your helmets, uncage your emotional support pets, or if you must, anger bake while listening. So yalla, let's get into it. For this episode, I'd like to discuss a topic that has affected individual people, groups, and nations since, one could say, the beginning of mankind. It is also a topic that has dominated much of the media for the last several years and has brought unfathomable changes to millions of people in practically every country on earth, some more than others. It is unbiased towards individual countries, philosophies, or theologies, and forces all of us to make a choice. Now, whether that choice is born out of conviction, moral obligation, or ignorance, we still must choose. For some, it exists to uphold justice and peace, and for others, a tool fashioned by wicked ideologies that call for the annihilation of those who oppose them. In the last couple of years in particular, it has been the hot topic of discussion on social media, which has, whether consciously or subconsciously, altered our view of it, whether we care to admit it or not. This might reign true more so for the majority of us who live in the West and are not directly affected by it and have been free of its direct physical effects for years now. Of course, this doesn't stop us from labeling the subject and forming strong opinions about it. If you haven't guessed it by now, and I'm certain many of you have, the topic I speak of is war. I invite you to pause and think about these questions with me. What justifies war? How should we think about war, and why does that even matter? What is your primary lens for viewing these things? What worldview do you hold that shapes these thoughts internally? Now, out of professional duty and obligation to you, I asked Professor and scholar ChatGPT what he thought war was. And ChatGPT so kindly replied, "War is a state of organized, violent conflict between groups, typically nations, states, or political factions, fought to achieve power, territory, and ideology or survival. It is both a physical and psychological event, shaped by weapons, strategies, and human decisions, but also by fear, memory, and belief." And I thought, okay, well, that's fair enough. It's pretty interesting. Professor ChatGPT expanded with why the question matters, saying, asking what is war isn't just about history or military theory. It's about understanding why violence escalates, what we're willing to fight for, and how peace can be more than just the absence of bloodshed. I thought this was a rather profound and wise response, so I thank you, ChatGPT. Now, unless you're a complete psychopath, I would bet that the vast majority of us don't long for war. Unless we live entrenched in the forest without access to modern devices, or perhaps dwell in solitude in the Himalayas. Doesn't that sound nice some days? Most of us should be aware of the ongoing wars or even rumors of wars going on around the world. To name a sampling of some of the current wars, there is, of course, Israel's fight against the terrorist organizations Hamas and Hezbollah, the most recent event that just about the whole world grew privy to, and rightly so, being the horrific and gruesome massacre of well over 1,000 innocent lives that took place on October 7th, 2023, by the terrorist organization Hamas. And that's not to mention their neighbors, whose governments hold to an ideology that, to put it as mildly as possible, is not fond of their existence. Israel knows what it is to war consistently against enemies, and knows it well. You will want to stay tuned for the next couple of episodes, as we will hear from an amazing man who knows what it is to live through war, the destruction that comes from enemies bent on annihilating them, and last but certainly not least, knows far more about the war in Israel than I ever would. Jumping northeast of Israel, there's the ongoing war against minority groups in Syria. In particular, I speak of the Christians who have been targeted under the shadow of a rising jihadist influence. One of the biggest incidents, of course, being this year on June 22nd, where a suicide bomber entered the Mars Elias Greek Orthodox Church in Damascus and detonated an explosive vest, killing at least 25 worshippers and injuring several others. It is the deadliest single attack on Christians in Syria in nearly a decade. This serves as an example of what it looks like when war is used due to surrendering to a religious ideology which not only accepts war, but demands the killing of innocent people to prosper and expand its religious doctrine. Then, of course, there's the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, leading to tens of thousands of deaths and the displacement of millions, triggering global economic ripple effects, if you will. And the less-known Sudanese civil war in Africa between the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the paramilitaries named the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, which has led to the displacement of millions of people, caused thousands of deaths, and tremendous food shortages, resulting in what some in the media have called an absolute humanitarian crisis. From churches in Syria to the capital city of Khartoum in Sudan, war rages on. And of course we know this list only goes on. Now, as we've seen in these examples, and have seen throughout the course of history, clearly war is never without turmoil and grief. We also find that throughout history, war has never been concerned about moral or equal outcomes. That is the belief that country A is allowed to engage in combat only insofar as country B defines as morally equal. For example, if Bobby throws a punch and aims to kill Sam, Sam can throw punches only equal to the measure that Bobby says is a sufficient response. Anything else is considered unfair, regardless of Bobby's motive to kill Sam. Of course, this is my elementary definition, but hopefully you get the gist, an idea that we will circle back to in later episodes. Speaking of history, let's now turn our attention onto those who lived before us and hear what they have to say on the topic. But before we do, full disclosure, we are going to dive into the deep end with history for a little bit, but please bear with me, class. It will be worth it. There is a method to my madness. We will hold hands and jump in together. In the opening chapter of The Art of War, military strategist and philosopher, Sun Tzu identifies what he calls the 5 constant factors that determine the outcome of war. These factors include the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and lastly, method and discipline. After listing what Tzu labels as the 5 constant factors, he states, "These 5 heads should be familiar to every general. He who knows them will be victorious. He who knows them not will fail." In the first chapter, Tzu goes on to say, essentially, that the moral law is all about trust, unity, and shared purpose. It's the invisible force that binds an army to its leader. When people believe in a cause and the character of their commander, they'll fight with courage and stay loyal throughout chaos. Without that moral bond, even the strongest army can fall apart from within. Now let's fast forward to the 20th century, where we turn our attention to a very different time, on a very different continent, with a very different leader. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister during World War II, was not only a wartime leader, but a master of words and a warrior of will. Winston Churchill stood at the crossroads of history when the world teetered on the edge of total darkness. His voice became the voice of resistance and the backbone of Britain's fight for freedom. On June 4th, 1940, just after the Dunkirk evacuation had concluded, Churchill stood before Parliament and delivered one of his most powerful speeches. The essence of the speech was that Britain would not give up, no matter the cost. This was the moment when Churchill's leadership really began to shine. His words to Britain were these: "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Churchill declared that Britain would never surrender. The words, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender," were a direct call to action. It was an affirmation that, no matter what happened, the British would not bow to the Nazis. They would fight, they would resist, and they would do so everywhere, from the shores to the streets, from the hills to the cities. This was, of course, a message to the people of Britain, but also a warning to the Germans that Britain would not be so easily defeated. Churchill was preparing the British people for a long, hard fight. He was asking them to dig deep, to find the strength to continue, and to hold firm to the belief that their victory was possible. The speech became a defining moment in Churchill's leadership and in the moral fortitude of the British people. The sheer resolve and defiance in his words gave the people of Britain something they desperately needed: hope. Even though the situation looked grim, Churchill's message was clear: surrender was not an option. And the war against evil was far from over. The speech helped rally the nation and prepare it for the coming Battle of Britain, which would be a critical turning point in the war. To Churchill, war wasn't something to be pursued lightly, but when faced with tyranny, when peace came at the cost of justice. He believed that war became not just necessary, but was the right thing to do. Now we're going to shift our attention to a book attributed to an author who was both a poet and a king, and whose writings have helped shape both the Jewish and Christian theological systems. One of the books of wisdom found in the Old Testament scriptures, the book of Ecclesiastes, believed to have been written by King Solomon in the 10th century, states this in chapter 3, verse 1, reading from the ESV: "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." Verse 7 says, "A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak." Verse 8 continues with, "A time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." That last part literally is rendered in the Hebrew, "Et melchama ve'et shalom." King Solomon, in all his wisdom, found that there indeed was a time for war. I'm going to state the obvious and conclude out loud that, according to King Solomon, to engage in war when indeed it is necessary is the opposite of evil. To fight for righteousness is actually good. Now, I know that opens up a whole other topic of discussion. What is considered righteous to one group? Perhaps the death of those who oppose their God or theological system, or who aren't considered righteous. And to another, it's following their gods. But we're going to hold to the definition that states the behavior that is morally honorable and obedient to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we can get into that more in later episodes. One of the well-known epithets or titles for the God of Israel in the Old Testament is the Lord of Hosts or Armies, literally tzvaot in Hebrew. That is the Lord of Armies. An epithet which speaks of God's majesty, military might, and divine command over all forces. Lexham Bible Dictionary states that, quote, "The phrase Lord of Hosts communicates God's role as a warrior who fights both in the cosmic conflict against divine forces and through human historical events for his people, Israel." The phrase appears 285 times in the Old Testament with a high concentration in the prophets, end quote. One of the famous biblical stories using this title is none other than the famous pre-battle scene we all know and love between David and Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, verses 41 through 45, reading from the ESV, reads, "And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance." I love that part. Goliath's like, "You are handsome, I hate you even more now." Jumping to verse 44, the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts," that is tzvaot, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Just for kicks, let's go ahead and read the next part too. Verse 46 states, This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistine this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. End quote. So good. I want to spend another hour on this, but I will spare you this time and stay the course. So, class, should David have killed the Philistine Goliath who openly mocked Israel and the Lord of armies? Of course. This victory served as a proclamation of the Lord's salvation for his people. It was no accident that David called, in this case, the Lord of armies. David acknowledged in the presence of the enemy his help came from the commander of armies, and that Goliath need be aware of who it was that fought for him. There is a time for war. So in summary of this fitting title, the Lord of armies indicates that there was and is, as said previously, a time for war. The Lord of hosts, the commander-in-chief over the armies, if you will, fought and fights for his people. He is a righteous ruler, hence his fight is a righteous one, often stepping in to save his people, conquer his enemy bent on evil, and create peace. Looking at war in the Bible in more of a broader sense, it certainly doesn't shy away from war, but it always points to peace, not as the absence of conflict, but as the presence of justice and mercy. As Moses once wrote to the petrified Israelites in Exodus 14:14, quote, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." For our next historical example, let's turn to a man perhaps better known for lions and wardrobes, but who also knew the trenches of war and spent many choice words on the weight of moral choice. Clive Staple Lewis, or better known as C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was born in what was Belfast, Ireland in 1898, fought in the First World War, was wounded in combat by shrapnel during the Battle of Arras, you have to say it like that, Arras in France, and was no stranger to grief, having lost several friends in battle. During the Second World War, he delivered lectures not simply to entertain, but to challenge the conscience. In one of these famous talks titled, "Why I Am Not a Pacifist," Lewis confronts a question many of us still wrestle with. When is war justified? Can a person of faith or a person of conscience ever take up arms? He writes, quote, "If war is ever lawful, then peace is sometimes sinful. If war is ever lawful, then peace is sometimes sinful." Definitely a statement that requires one to pause and think. Lewis isn't glorifying violence, but warning us against moral laziness. It is a statement warning us not to let comfort, fear, or a shallow desire to remain ignorant keep us from the fact that resisting evil demands more than silence. In fact, quite the opposite. Resisting evil requires action. Now, my last example speaks of meek courage in battle, not weak or defenseless, don't mishear me, but meek. Some voices in wartime come not from the battlefield, but from the quiet corners where fierce courage speaks softly while confronted with unfathomable horrors witnessed in the day-to-day. Many of us are familiar with her story, and yet it is one worth mentioning and repeating. Cornelia, or Corrie ten Boom, wasn't a soldier, but a Dutch watchmaker who, during World War II, helped hundreds of Jews by hiding them from the Nazis in a secret room behind her family shop. The entire family, motivated by their Christian faith, actively participated in hiding Jews and other refugees, knowing the grave risks involved. Despite their careful efforts, the ten Booms were betrayed by an informant and were arrested, imprisoned, and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Corrie's war was not fought with physical weapons, but was a war against unspeakable evil. Her weapon was compassion at the risk of her reputation, her entire family, and her life. She watched a world unravel and still chose to believe in mercy. In a time when hatred was law, she made kindness resistance, and even after the war, ultimately, through her faith in God, she chose forgiveness over vengeance. Corrie ten Boom was a warrior. When it would have been easy to let fear paralyze her, she chose to fight for the truth. Surrounded by those who kneeled to evil, Corrie and her family chose to stand for love. You could say hers was a war within a war. Often quiet and centered on her faith, she was no less potent on the battlefield. If you've not read Corrie ten Boom's autobiography, The Hiding Place, or if you have read The Hiding Place, read it again. The book highlights Corey's resilience under a wicked law and her unwavering belief in God. Even in the face of immense suffering, readers should experience the hiding place not just for its historical significance, but also for its tireless messages about compassion, sacrifice, and the triumph of hope over hatred. All right, class, thus far we have marched through several historical narratives and have been reminded of current wars. Through events both modern and historical, we see that war indeed plays a vital role in religious spiritual systems and in shaping the future outlook of both countries and people. In ancient times, it was often seen as creating order out of disorder or evil, used to defend or create the establishment of people groups and nations. Now, clearly there are hundreds and hundreds of more ancient accounts we could go into, and I know it breaks your heart that I don't have at least 30 more stories and 5 more hours to share. But alas, this goal is not to exhaust resources, but give you some examples of how war was and is being depicted and used, not just as a means to enhance a wicked agenda, but to put an end to a wicked agenda, that people might live. Now let's have some fun and play devil's advocate for a second. You say, okay, Amy, but why? Why care about the seemingly random or irrelevant historical accounts of war? And by the way, I don't live in Sudan or Syria, so what does it matter? Well, it's quite easy for us to forget, isn't it? Embarrassingly easy for us to take on a posture of apathy. It doesn't directly affect us, right? That is, until it does. If we forget, if we adopt that all too modern narcissistic trend of me first, allowing ourselves to be carried away by the latest trend or blindly adopting the opinions of others, well, we fall victim to foolish ideologies and become easily swayed by sharp tongues that craft lies sounding all too much like truths. The battle always starts in the mind. How many times a day do our thoughts challenge us to surrender to our own desires, or the harder option, accept the truth? Not that those are mutually exclusive. If we forget the wars of the past, we forget the horrors that evil produces and thus surrender ourselves to ignorance. We don't know how to fight that same evil in the future. That's quite scary. If history has shown us anything, if current conflict shows us something, it's that evil ideologies remain an ongoing problem. Wickedness doesn't lie dormant simply because we don't think we feel its direct effect. Evil is active and ongoing, and always, always worth fighting. So we've talked about war in the physical sense, but is it always only seen on the physical battlefield? What about spiritual warfare, or the battlefield of the mind? Topics that we will address further in the series leave no stone unturned, correct? Well, that would require a continuation of the series beyond the grave, unfortunately, but I will do my best to uncover as many stones as seems necessary. There is certainly, without a shadow of a doubt, a war raging within us, one of the hot topics that unfortunately seems to have grown by leaps and bounds since the rise and reign of the social media gods has been the war on self-image. What happens when your reflection is filtered through likes, comments, and comparisons? They say comparison is the thief of joy, but what happens when on social media it becomes more or less the business model? What happens when what once was scrolling cat videos and recipe hacks morphs into a perpetual pattern of viewing yourself through the lens of what you're not? What happens when workout motivational videos become both to the viewer and poster alike a means of achieving more than the other person, and instead of realizing that filters are available to the masses, we start seeing ourselves through the lens of what no human being was ever made to be, a caricature really, not focused on loving others, but rather needing likes. Perhaps these are the questions we should be actively asking ourselves. Perhaps these are the questions we have forgotten. A Pew Research study found that nearly 60% of teens feel pressure to look perfect online, not simply good or okay, but perfect. Every photo, every post. We used to ask kids what they wanted to be when they grow up. Now they're being asked how many followers they have. What does that do to a sense of worth? The dangerous thing about this war is, in many ways, it's silent. Self-esteem spirals out of control, all while silently scrolling. Instead of viewing ourselves as crafted in the image of our Creator, loved and adored, as Psalm 139 beautifully describes, we outsource our identities to an algorithm. Again, this topic will be discussed in greater detail, but definitely food for thought. Now, I know that I have merely scratched the surface of the topic of war. That might even be too generous a saying. And as we close today's reflection on war, you might be left with more questions than answers. And you know what? I'm okay with that. And if any of this has caused you to pause and reflect, I'll consider that a win. So through our short time together today, we've seen that war is not just fought with weapons. It is waged in hearts, in ideologies, and in the silence between grief and survival. From the trenches of history to the sacred pages of scripture, we see humanity's choice between destruction and redemption. Well, that wraps up our time together for today. So Yalla, keep asking questions, seek the truth, and allow yourself to pause and think deeply. And until next time, know that you have value, were created for a unique purpose, and are deeply loved by God. Ashuvukum qaribun and leitrot. We'll chat soon.